I want you to try and imagine something with me for a second. And I mean, I don't want you to just sort of picture it in your head. I want you to really try and feel the physical logistics of it.
Yeah, put yourself right there in the moment.
Exactly. So it's the middle of the night. It is absolutely freezing cold, like that kind of deep cold that just bites right through your coat, makes your hands completely numb.
Right.
And you're standing in the hallway of the house you grew up in. You know, the walls around you, they hold generations of your family's history. But you are holding exactly one suitcase.
Just one.
One suitcase. And you've got maybe, what, 20 minutes to frantically pack your entire life into that single piece of luggage.
It's just impossible.
It is. I mean, you have to make these impossible choices. Do you take the heavy winter coats or do you pack the family photographs?
Right, the practical versus the sentimental.
Yeah, like do you pack your university degrees or do you literally just pack food? And then, you finally zip it shut, you walk out the front door, you lock it, and you slip this heavy metal key into your pocket.
Wow.
And as you're walking away in the pitch dark, you're listening to these sounds of just total chaos echoing down the street. And there is this sinking, terrifying realization creeping into your chest that you might never, ever put that key back into that lock.
Yeah, that is a psychological rupture that's just incredibly difficult to convey through standard, historical analysis.
Right.
Because when we normally talk about displacement, we tend to look at the statistics, like how many people moved from point A to point B.
The spreadsheets, yeah.
Exactly, the data.
Yeah.
But the actual raw human experience is that sudden absolute severing of your roots. It's the overnight realization that the physical geography, the soil that actually defines your identity, has violently rejected you.
And for the Kashmiri Pandit community, the Kashmiri Hindus, this is not just some abstract thought experiment. It's not a movie scene. This is their actual reality.
Yeah, sadly.
It is the defining generational trauma of their modern existence. So welcome to this deep dive, because our mission today is a massive one.
It really is. We've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do. We are going to attempt to cut through decades of this intense, incredibly dense, and honestly often deafening political noise, right? We want to understand the multi-layered tragedy of the Kashmiri Pandits.
And we have a formidable stack of sources to get through today.
Oh, absolutely massive.
We're looking at deep historical records, demographic research, raw firsthand accounts from the late 1980s, and even current political analyses that stretch all the way into our present day here in 2026.
Yeah, so we're going to explore the deep historical roots of this conflict, the absolute boiling point of the 1980s, the terrifying targeted killings of 1989 and 1990, and we really need to get into the deeply contested narratives between the Hindu and Muslim communities of the Kashmir Valley.
Which is so crucial, yeah.
Plus the ongoing, really desperate struggle for identity and rehabilitation today.
Right, because it's critical we take this wide approach looking at the entire timeline. I mean, we live in a world that is just saturated with weaponized history and fragmented narratives.
Totally.
So simply knowing the dates of an exodus, it's completely insufficient. Understanding the mechanisms of displacement, like why things happened, how genuine political grievances morphed into communal terror, and how a community adapts to exile over several decades, is the only way you grasp the full picture.
Right. So our goal here is to examine all these sources impartially. We've got to look at the conflicting narratives and really understand the sociology of a community's exile.
And how those historical shockwaves are still shaping the political landscape today in 2026.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because you can't just, drop a listener into January of 1990 and expect them to understand the sheer magnitude of what happened.
No, not at all.
The raw panic of that mass exodus, it didn't just manifest out of thin air on a random winter night. To actually grasp the weight of that 1990 flight from the Kashmir Valley, we've got to look at the sociology of the region.
Yeah, the deep context.
Right, because this was not a freak, isolated incident. Tragically, it was part of this massive cyclical history of persecution and displacement. So we really have to start with the foundational question, which is, who are the Kashmiri Pandits?
Well, the sources are very, very clear on the deep indigenous roots of this community. We're talking about Saraswat Brahmins.
Okay.
They are the original inhabitants of the Kashmir Valley. They have a continuous documented history stretching back over 4,000 years.
Over 4,000 years, wow.
So this isn't a group that just migrated to the region in recent history. They are deeply, inextricably embedded in the very soil and the ancient culture of the valley. I mean, culturally and philosophically, they're actually responsible for developing Kashmir Shaivism.
I actually want to pause on Kashmir Shaivism for a second
Right.
because the sources highlight it, but I don't want us to just gloss over what it actually means.
Sure.
Because from what I'm reading, it's not just a basic set of rituals, it's an incredibly sophisticated, non-dualistic philosophy, right?
But it is profoundly sophisticated. So non-dualism in this context basically means they view the entire universe, everything material and immaterial, as the direct manifestation of pure consciousness, which they identify as Shiva.
Okay, so no separation between the creator and the creation.
Exactly. It's a deeply intellectual, introspective tradition.
Yeah.
And because of this intense focus on intellect and spiritual philosophy, for centuries, Kashmir was renowned across the continent as the Sharda Peeth.
The seat of learning.
Right, the ultimate seat of learning in the Indian subcontinent. You had scholars traveling incredibly long distances, traversing dangerous mountain passes, just to go study under the Pandits in Kashmir.
But reading through the historical timelines in our sources, that legacy of learning and philosophy, it honestly feels like it was constantly under siege.
Yeah, well,
Because when you look at the community's own internal narrative today, the 1990 Exodus is almost universally referred to as the Ninth Exodus.
the ninth, yes.
Which is just staggering. Between the early 14th century and 1990, there were 8 distinct periods of severe persecution.
Yeah, the historical record outlined in the texts is unsparing.
Yeah.
I mean, the cycle of mass displacement really kicks off in earnest around 1320.
With the invasion of Zulju, right?
Yes, Zulju. He was a Turco-Mongol commander. And his invasion wasn't just, a political conquest. It brought utter devastation, widespread slaughter, and really the first major disruption of the Pandit community's stability in the valley.
Wow.
But the structural, religious persecution, that becomes codified a bit later, particularly between 1389 and 1413 under Sultan Sikandar.
Oh, the sources refer to him as Sikandar Buchikan.
Exactly, which translates directly to the iconoclast, or the idol breaker.
Right.
His reign was totally characterized by the systemic, state-sponsored destruction of ancient Hindu temples. I mean, the magnificent Sun Temple at Martand, which was this architectural marvel of the ancient world that was destroyed under his orders.
That's heartbreaking.
It is, and he essentially presented the Pandits with a brutal, unavoidable ultimatum. He basically said, you convert to Islam, you flee the valley, or you get killed.
And the mechanism of that persecution really evolved, didn't it? Like, it wasn't just physical violence, it became this administrative entrapment.
Right, yeah.
Because if you look at his son, Ali Shah, the sources mention that during Ali Shah's rule, the state actually deployed armed guards at the mountain passes.
Yeah, to block the exits.
Right. Their specific job was to physically trap the Pandits inside the valley, basically removing the flee option from that ultimatum just so they could be forcefully converted.
It's terrifying, and we see this exact cycle repeat in the 1500s under figures like Kaji Chak and Musa Raina. That whole era was heavily influenced by the missionary Mir Shamsuddin Iraqi, which led to another massive wave of forced conversions and the massacre of anyone who resisted.
And then moving into the late 1600s, right, the sources talk about the Mughal governor Iftikhar Khan.
Yes, so he employed such extreme force and discriminatory policies that the Kashmiri Pandits actually sent a delegation completely out of the valley to seek the protection of the Sikh guru Tika Lal Taploo.
Wow, reaching out for help.
Exactly. And Guru Teg Bahadur actually stood up for their right to practice their religion. And because of that defense, he was subsequently executed by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb.
God.
And as the Mughal Empire started to decline into the 1720s, local clerics filled that power vacuum. So you have people like Mullah Abdul Nabi imposing the jizya, which is a religious tax on non-Muslims.
Right, the jizya.
And he subjected the Pandits to heavily humiliating social restrictions.
Yeah.
I mean, they were legally banned from wearing turbans, from wearing shoes, and from riding horses.
So just a systematic stripping of any dignity or social standards.
Exactly.
And then I'm looking at the accounts of the Afghan rule, which lasted from, 1753 to 1819?
Yeah, the Afghan period.
If the previous centuries were about conversion and social humiliation, this Afghan period reads like pure, unadulterated terror.
It really does.
I mean, the primary sources from that era coined this chilling phrase. They said, "A Pandit's life was not worth the price of a hen." The level of cruelty is staggering. The Afghan governors instituted this method of execution where they would tie Pandits together in pairs, stuff them into coarse grass sacks, and literally drown them in the waters of Dal Lake.
It is a profoundly dark, heavy history to process.
Mm-hmm.
But, to maintain an impartial and comprehensive view of this 4,000-year history, Our sources also make it clear that the timeline wasn't just an unbroken line of darkness.
Right. There were reprieves?
Yes, there were significant periods of genuine harmony, syncretism, and flourishing.
Mm.
So if you can go back to the 8th century, the reign of Lalitaditya Muktapida was an undeniable golden age of architecture and military expansion.
Not sure.
But perhaps more relevant to the cycle of exodus and return is the 15th century rule of Sultan Zain al Abidin.
Ah, the king, the Kashmiri is referred to as Butsha.
Butsha, exactly, the great king. So after the extreme brutality of his predecessors, Zain al Abidin instituted this period of incredible tolerance and state-sponsored pluralism. He actively reached out and invited the exiled Pandits to return to the Kashmir Valley. He patronized their scholarship, translated Sanskrit texts, and allowed their culture and religion to thrive openly.
Okay, but this is exactly what I need to push back on. Because reading this timeline, I kept coming up against this mental wall.
What do you mean?
Well, it sounds like building an incredibly elaborate, beautiful sandcastle on a beach, right? While knowing with absolute certainty that the tide is going to eventually come in and wash it away.
That's a good analogy.
You build it, the wave destroys it, the water recedes, you walk back onto the wet sand, and you build it again, over and over, 8 different times.
Yeah.
How does a community possibly preserve its culture, its sanity, and its identity through 8 different destructive tides?
Yep.
I mean, most cultures would just completely assimilate or vanish entirely.
It's a vital question. And really, understanding the mechanism of their survival is the key to understanding the modern Kashmiri Pandit identity we see in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Okay, how do they do it?
Well, when you are repeatedly subjected to this cycle, when you're deprived of political power, when your ancestral land is constantly confiscated and your physical wealth is repeatedly looted, you have to make a collective generational pivot to survive.
Right.
The Pandits realize that physical assets are vulnerable. So they double down on the one asset that is entirely unstealable: education and scholarship.
It's the ultimate portable wealth.
Precisely. If you cannot trust the physical ground beneath your feet, you build an impenetrable fortress in your mind. They basically leveraged their ancient heritage of learning and transformed it into administrative indispensableness.
Making themselves needed.
Exactly. This intense, almost singular cultural focus on education explains why, across centuries and under various regimes, even those that were openly hostile to them, they consistently rose to prominence. As administrators, physicians, bureaucrats, and advisors, they made themselves necessary to whoever was in power.
And that strategy carried right over into post-independence India, didn't it?
It absolutely did.
You look at the political landscape after 1947, and their influence was vastly disproportionate to their actual numbers. Like, take Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's inner circle, for instance.
Right.
Her top political advisors, the group famously referred to in Delhi circles as the Panch PR, the 5 beloved ones, they were largely Kashmiri Pandits.
Yes.
And we see this right up to today in 2026 with highly influential diplomats and national security figures like Vikram Misri sharing this heritage. Their survival mechanism was essentially to insulate themselves through exceptionalism.
And that post-1947 context in India is so crucial for setting the stage for the 1990 crisis. Because after the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir acceded to India, there was a multi-decade period of relative stability, secular integration, and genuine coexistence.
Right.
The Pandits were a microscopic minority in the valley, representing roughly maybe 4 to 5% of the total population, but they were deeply intricately woven into the social fabric.
Yeah, they were the teachers, the doctors.
Highly respected civil servants, yeah.
Mm.
The Kashmiri Muslims and the Kashmiri Pandits share what's called the Kashmiriyat culture. They shared language, cuisine, certain syncretic traditions.
Which brings us to the modern catalyst, and this is where the historical whiplash happens for me.
Yeah, it shifts fast.
Because if things were relatively stable, if they were living side by side sharing this Kashmiriyat culture, how did we go from neighbors attending each other's weddings to a violent armed insurgency targeting minorities in just a matter of years?
It's a huge shift.
We have to move from ancient history into the highly charged political atmosphere of 1980s Kashmir.
Right. So to understand that unraveling, we have to look closely at the political machinery of the state.
Yeah.
The catalyst, which is heavily documented by political historians and journalists of the era, was the 1987 state assembly elections in Jammu and Kashmir.
Okay, the 1987 election.
Yeah, leading up to this election, you had a massive coalition of various Islamic organizations, youth groups, and anti-establishment political factions, and they all united under a single banner, the Muslim United Front, or MUF.
And from the sources, it seems like the MUF was tapping into a very real, very potent frustration.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the ruling establishment at the time was this alliance between the National Conference, the dominant regional party, and the Indian National Congress, which was the ruling party at the center in New Delhi.
Right.
And the MUF managed to mobilize incredible grassroots support. They were organizing massive rallies that genuinely threatened the ruling alliance's grip on power.
The political energy in the valley was palpable. I mean, for many young Kashmiris, this was really their first real foray into the democratic process. They genuinely believed they could affect change through the ballot box.
Right.
But when the election results were announced, they did not reflect that massive grassroots mobilization at all. The 1987 elections are almost universally acknowledged by political analysts, human rights observers, and historians to have been massively systematically rigged in favor of the ruling National Conference Congress alliance.
And I want to be really specific about what rigged means here, because it wasn't just some, subtle manipulation of district lines.
No.
We are talking about blatant brute force electoral fraud. The sources describe ballot boxes being literally thrown out or swapped. We're talking about MUF candidates who were heavily leading the vote counts suddenly just being declared the losers.
Yeah.
And worse, when those candidates and their campaign workers protested that blatant fraud, they were physically beaten by the state police and thrown into prison without a trial.
And that physical brutalization of the democratic process, that is the exact mechanism of radicalization.
Yeah.
When you systematically shut down all legitimate democratic avenues for dissent and you physically punish the people who actually tried to play by the rules of the Constitution, you create an incredibly dangerous vacuum.
Right.
The 1987 election was the undeniable turning point. It took genuine democratic political grievances against the Indian state and mutated them. The youth who were beaten in those polling stations essentially realized they could not fight the state with ballots, so they crossed the border to get bullets.
And out of that massive disenfranchisement, the armed insurgency is born. In 1988, we see the rise of the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, the JKLF. But what I find so deeply complex here is the ideological evolution of it. Because the JKLF didn't start out as a religious extremist group.
No, they didn't.
Initially, their ideology was largely secular and highly nationalistic. Their core demand was an independent Kashmir, a state completely independent from both India and Pakistan.
And that is a critical distinction to make. The early rhetoric of the insurgency was built entirely around Kashmiriyat, that unique ethno-cultural identity of the Kashmiri people.
Right.
It was a political revolt against New Delhi's interference. But a secular pro-independence movement right on its border was not in the strategic interest of Pakistan. And this is where the geopolitical proxy war enters the frame.
Okay.
Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, recognized the immense anger brewing in the valley and moved to aggressively co-opt the insurgency.
But how exactly do you co-opt a grassroots movement like that?
You control the resources. The ISI began redirecting their funding, their weapons, and their training camps away from the secular pro-independence JKLF and started pouring massive support into much more radical, explicitly Islamist groups. Groups like Jamaat Islami and primarily the Hizbul Mujahideen.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and as the weapons and the money flowed toward those Islamist factions, the entire ideology of the insurgency shifted rapidly and violently.
Right.
It went from demanding a secular independent state to demanding a direct merger with Pakistan and the establishment of Nizam-e-Mustafa.
Nizam-e-Mustafa, which is an administrative and social order based strictly on Islamic law.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm following the geopolitical shift, but this is exactly where I get lost regarding the human cost on the ground.
What part?
If the original fight in 1987 and 1988 was a political revolt against the Indian government's electoral rigging, why did a tiny minority community of roughly 120,000 to 140,000 Hindu civilians suddenly become the primary target?
Yeah.
Like, if you are fighting the state apparatus, why turn your guns on the local school teacher or the neighborhood doctor?
Because it's the catastrophic intersection of religion and nationalism.
Okay.
As the insurgency was forcefully injected with this heavy Islamist ideology by foreign funding, the very definition of who actually belonged in Kashmir changed. The Kashmiri Pandits found themselves in an impossible, fatal position.
Right.
Because of their Hindu faith and their historically vocal patriotism and alignment with the idea of a secular, integrated India, they were no longer viewed by the radicalized militants as fellow Kashmiris. They were stripped of their local identity and projected purely as physical symbols, extensions, and basically agents of the Indian state.
God, it's just a tragic contamination of a movement. You have the genuine, deeply felt political grievances of the Kashmiri Muslims regarding their democratic rights being stolen in 1987.
Right.
But that legitimate anger gets completely hijacked by religious radicalism, which inherently alienated, vilified, and ultimately endangered the minority population that literally lived right next door to them.
Exactly. And the ideological shift in the late 1980s did not remain abstract rhetoric just discussed in militant hideouts.
Yeah.
It very quickly materialized into physical, calculated violence.
Yeah.
And the strategy employed by these newly empowered militant groups was chillingly precise. They didn't just start random riots. They wanted to strike maximum psychological terror into the entire Pandit community. And to do that, they began systematically eliminating the community's highest profile, most respected members.
Which brings us to 1989, and this is where the panic truly sets in. I want to look at September 14th, 1989, because this date is etched into the collective trauma of the community.
Yeah, there really is.
Today, it's actually commemorated as Martyrs' Day by Kashmiri Hindus worldwide. On this day, Tika Lal Taploo was assassinated. Now, Taploo wasn't just anybody. He was a highly prominent lawyer, a beloved social worker, and importantly, he was a senior leader of the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, a major Hindu nationalist party in the state.
Right.
He was gunned down by the JKLF in broad daylight outside his home in Srinagar.
The assassination of Tika Lal Taploo was a massive shockwave. It was a proof of concept for the militants.
Yeah.
The message was extremely clear. If a leader of his stature, with his political connections and public visibility, can be gunned down in the street and the killers simply vanish without consequence, then the state cannot protect you. No one is safe.
And they followed this up just weeks later, right? In November 1989, with the assassination of Judge Nilakanth Ganjoo.
Yes. And the targeting of Judge Ganjoo was deeply symbolic.
Highly symbolic, yeah.
Because Judge Ganjoo was specifically targeted for an action he took within the legal system years earlier. He was the judge who had presided over a major trial and ultimately sentenced the original founder of the JKLF, Makbul Bhatt, to death.
Wow.
So murdering Judge Ganjoo wasn't just about eliminating a prominent Hindu. It was a clear message of retribution. It was the militants asserting that they, not the Indian judiciary, held the ultimate power over life and death in the valley.
The sources outline so many of these targeted killings, but there is one story that completely stopped me in my tracks.
Which one?
It's the murder of Lassa Kaul on February 13th, 1990. I really want to spend some time on this because it perfectly encapsulates the utter breakdown of social trust. So Lassa Kaul was 45 years old. He was the director of Doordarshan Srinagar, which was the state-run television network.
Yeah, Lassa Kaul is a profoundly tragic figure in this history. Because by all accounts, he was a calm, incredibly composed, highly cultured man. He was known for being deeply committed to his work.
Right.
And he was highly popular, not just among his Hindu peers, but notably among his Muslim colleagues and friends within the television station.
But because he was the director of the state broadcaster, the militants projected him as an enemy of Islam. They claimed he was launching a cultural aggression against the Kashmiri people by continuing to air pro-India and secular television programming. The details of his assassination are just devastating. It was late in the evening. He was leaving the television center to go visit his elderly, ailing parents who lived on the outskirts of the city. He never made it to their house. He was gunned down the moment he stepped out of the facility. But the truly chilling part, the part that genuinely makes my blood run cold, is the betrayal.
Yes. The internal reports and investigative accounts strongly suggest that his killers, allegedly operatives of the JKLF, knew exactly where to be and exactly when to strike.
They didn't just guess.
No, they didn't just guess a schedule. They were waiting for him because they had been explicitly tipped off by his own subordinates inside the television center.
God.
Colleagues he worked with every single day, people he managed and likely mentored, allegedly picked up a phone and informed the militants of his exact departure time.
I just can't even fathom the psychological toll of that. It's like being in a submarine and realizing someone on board is quietly opening the airlocks.
That's exactly what it felt like.
Because it's one thing to fear a masked gunman in the street. You can hide from a gunman. But it is an entirely different, suffocating layer of terror when you realize the person tipping off the gunman is the guy who shares your office water cooler. How do you ever sleep? How do you look your neighbors in the eye? The paranoia must have been absolute.
The societal fabric completely unraveled. When you realize the threat isn't just external, but intimately internal, trust evaporates overnight. And the murder of Lassa Kaul was followed by a wave of brutality that escalated beyond simple assassinations into grotesque, performative violence designed to maximize horror.
Yeah.
We're looking at the case of Sarankul Premi, a veteran, highly revered Kashmiri poet and scholar who was abducted and brutally hanged along with his young son.
And the accounts of the women targeted are equally, if not more, horrific. Girija Tiku, a young university teacher, was abducted, gang-raped, and then brutally murdered with a mechanical saw.
It's horrifying.
Sarlapat, a nurse working at a local medical institute, faced a similarly horrific fate after allegedly overhearing conversations between militants being treated at the hospital.
It is. But as we navigate this incredibly dark history, our mandate is to maintain an objective analytical lens, right?
Right.
So we must look at how these events were interpreted and rationalized at the time. The militant organizations and the factions that sympathized with them frequently issued statements claiming that these individuals, the judge, the TV director, the political leader, the nurse, were targeted strictly because they were agents of the Indian state, part of the intelligence apparatus, or informants.
But when you look at the sheer brutality of a poet being hanged or a teacher being killed with a saw, that rationalization completely falls apart for the Pandit community.
Right, of course.
They looked at the exclusive targeting of Hindus, the grotesque nature of the violence, and rightly viewed this not as a political rebellion, but as a coordinated communal campaign of terror designed explicitly to ethnically cleanse the valley of its indigenous minority.
And those targeted assassinations throughout the latter half of 1989 essentially acted as a pressure cooker. They primed the entire Pandit community for mass panic. The fuse was lit, the community was terrified, but they were still largely in their homes.
Right.
It was a very specific, coordinated series of events in January 1990 that caused the actual explosion of the mass overnight exodus. And as we transition to discussing January 1990, we are entering heavily contested territory. We have to navigate a historical minefield because we are looking at two vastly different communal memories of the exact same timeline.
Yeah, January 1990 is the absolute tipping point. The physical violence was already there, but now the psychological warfare escalated dramatically and publicly. Local Srinagar newspapers, specifically prominent dailies like Aftab and Al Safa, began publishing highly threatening messages. Yeah. And these weren't subtle. They were sourced directly to militant organizations like the Hizbul Mujahideen, outright demanding that all Hindus pack up and leave Kashmir immediately.
The intimidation tactics became inescapable. I mean, posters were pasted directly onto the front doors of Hindu homes in the dead of night. Unknown masked men would stop people on the street and force them at gunpoint to reset their wristwatches from Indian Standard Time to Pakistan Standard Time.
Wow.
Local offices, street signs, and even the shutters of shops were aggressively painted green overnight to visually signify the imminent arrival of Islamic rule.
But all of that was just the prelude to the night of January 18th and 19th, 1990, the night the dam broke.
Yeah, that night.
Put yourself in the shoes of a Kashmiri Pandit family.
Yeah.
You're already terrified by the assassinations. You've read the warnings in the paper. Suddenly, as the sun goes down, there is a total valley-wide blackout. All the electricity is cut. It is pitch black.
The only things that still have power are the loudspeakers mounted on the minarets of the local mosques.
Right. And throughout that freezing night, those loudspeakers start blaring divisive, violently inflammatory slogans.
The auditory terror of that night is a defining feature of the Kashmiri Pandit trauma.
Yeah.
The slogans echoing through the dark valley were explicit and genocidal. The most infamous was Raliv, Galiv, Yachaliv, which translates directly to convert, die, or leave. The loudspeakers declared the supremacy of Islam, announced the dawn of Nizamiya Mustafa, and called for a purge of the infidels.
The psychological warfare was flawless. You are sitting in the dark, clutching your children, shivering from the cold, and listening to voices, sometimes voices you actually recognize from your own neighborhood, amplified over loudspeakers, demanding your immediate expulsion or your death.
It's unbearable.
The result of that night was immediate and catastrophic. Between January and March of 1990, an estimated 90,000 to 100,000 Kashmiri Pandits fled the valley in sheer terror.
And to put that in perspective, the total population of the community of the valley was maybe 140,000. So you were looking at the vast majority of an ancient community uprooting itself in a matter of weeks.
Unbelievable.
They packed whatever they could carry in a single bag, hired whatever transport they could find at exorbitant rates, and ran for their lives towards the plains of Jammu.
But what makes this specific historical moment so incredibly complex to untangle today is what happened just 48 hours after that terrifying night.
Right.
As the Pandits were desperately fleeing down the highways, The valley exploded in a completely different way.
Yes. On January 21st, 1990, the Gokadal massacre took place in Srinagar. The Indian Security Forces, specifically the CRPF, the Central Reserve Police Force, which is a massive federal paramilitary force deployed for internal security, they opened fire on a massive crowd of Kashmiri Muslim protesters who were marching on the Gokadal Bridge.
God.
The official state numbers are always disputed, but at least 50, and likely over 160 Kashmiri Muslims were gunned down on that bridge by the state forces.
I am genuinely struggling to reconcile these timelines. Because I have to stop here. This is where the competing narratives become a wall.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
How can two communities living in the exact same geography experience the exact same week in January 1990 and walk away with two completely, fundamentally incompatible truths about who is to blame for the destruction of Kashmir?
This is where we have to rely on sociology to understand history. Sociologists who study conflict zones refer to this dynamic as cascading violence. You have two communities that both experience unspeakable, intense generational trauma within a 48-hour window.
Yeah.
The Kashmiri Pandits experienced the auditory terror of the mosques and the sudden violent loss of their ancestral homeland. Simultaneously, the Kashmiri Muslims experienced the brutal slaughter of their own people by the paramilitary forces at Gokadal.
It's just a massive cognitive overload for the entire society.
Right. When trauma is that fresh, that profound, and that immediate human psychology basically creates an impenetrable fortress. Neither community possesses the emotional bandwidth to hold space for the other's pain. The Kashmiri Muslims could not acknowledge the terror of the Pandits because they were burying their dead from the bridge.
Right.
And the Pandits could not acknowledge the state violence against the Muslims because they were freezing in refugee tents. And this intense psychological polarization brings us directly to the most deeply contested narrative of the entire Exodus.
The Jagmohan myth.
The Jagmohan myth, yes.
Right. Governor Jagmohan. Depending entirely on who you ask in Kashmir, this man is either the ultimate savior who prevented a genocide or the sinister architect of the entire tragedy.
It's a complete dichotomy.
Let's look at the Kashmiri Muslim perspective first, because it is deeply ingrained in the valley's narrative. Many Kashmiri Muslims strongly believe, and argue to this day, that Governor Jagmohan actively orchestrated the Pandit exodus.
Yes. The narrative from the valley posits that Jagmohan, representing the hardline approach of New Delhi, deliberately manufactured the panic. The claim is that he provided state transport buses and trucks to quietly clear the Hindus out of the valley.
Right.
And the alleged motive was to create a homogeneous Muslim population, which would then give the Indian military a completely free hand to ruthlessly crack down on the insurgency without having to worry about collateral damage to the Hindu minority.
But when you cross-reference that with the Kashmiri Pandit perspective and with Jagmohan's own historical defense and administrative records, that narrative is flatly, vehemently denied.
Oh, completely.
The historical records show that Jagmohan wasn't even in Srinagar on the night of January 19th. He had just been appointed, and due to severe winter weather, he was physically stuck in Jammu.
Yes, the administrative logs support this. Jagmohan spent that terrifying night in Jammu, fielding hundreds of desperate, terrified distress calls from Pandits who were trapped in their homes in Srinagar, begging for military rescue. The state apparatus had effectively collapsed. Local police were either overwhelmed, sympathetic to the militants, or terrified themselves.
Right.
Jagmohan was seen by the Pandits as the only official who was even picking up the phone. Furthermore, the documentary evidence shows that on March 7th, his administration actually issued an official press note. In it, he desperately appealed to the Pandits to stay in the valley or to return if they had left, offering to set up secure, state-protected camps within the valley in areas like Anantnag, Baramulla, and Kupwara.
And we also have to mention the massive controversy with Current magazine. During that highly charged period, they published this sensational interview claiming Jagmohan had explicitly stated that the bullet is the only solution for the Kashmir problem.
Ah, yes.
This quote was used endlessly to paint him as this bloodthirsty tyrant, but he sued the magazine for defamation, proved they completely fabricated the quote, and forced them to print a humiliating front-page apology.
The Jagmohan controversy perfectly illustrates the intensely paranoid environment of 1990. I mean, the air was just thick with rumors, political maneuvering, foreign interference, and absolute fear.
Yeah.
But whether one believes Jagmohan actively facilitated the flight to save them or simply failed to prevent it because the local law enforcement had dissolved, the undeniable physical result was the exact same. The Pandits left. And when they locked those doors, the vast majority of them expected to be gone for just a few weeks, maybe a few months, until the military restored order and things cooled down.
But the weeks turned into months. The months bled into years, and the years hardened into decades. And that desperate physical flight from the valley created a completely new, incredibly painful crisis. The reality of life in exile.
Yes.
When the Pandits finally reached the plains of Jammu or took trains down to Delhi, they weren't greeted with open arms, comfortable housing, and a warm meal.
Far from it. The Indian state was completely unprepared for the sheer scale of the internal displacement. The Pandits languished in squalid, hastily erected refugee camps, and the physical and climatic transition alone was brutal.
Oh, the heat.
Yeah. You had families who, just days prior, owned large, multi-story wooden homes surrounded by apple orchards in the cool, temperate climate of the Kashmir Valley. Suddenly, they were living in sweltering, unventilated canvas tents in the blistering 110-degree heat of Jammu. They were completely dependent on meager government relief rations just to survive.
I read accounts of diseases spreading through the camps, the total lack of basic sanitation, venomous snake bites in the tents. And the experience of this exile wasn't uniform across the community either.
No, it was very divided by class.
Right. The urban elite, the highly educated doctors, top-tier bureaucrats, and tech professionals who had resources and networks, they eventually found their footing. They migrated to Delhi, Mumbai, or left the country entirely for the US and UK.
Yeah.
But the rural lower-middle-class Pandits, the farmers and small shop owners, they suffered immensely. They faced severe poverty, deep psychological depression, and just a total loss of dignity.
Furthermore, they faced unexpected and painful clashes with their host communities. From an outside perspective, one might assume that because the Kashmiri Pandits are Hindus, they would seamlessly integrate and assimilate with the local Hindus in Jammu or Delhi.
Right, you'd think so.
But religion is only one facet of identity. The Saraswat Brahmins of Kashmir had vastly different cultural practices, deeply specific dietary habits, and different religious rituals than the Dogra Hindus native to Jammu.
It's like assuming someone from deep rural Texas will perfectly assimilate in downtown Boston just because they both speak English.
That's a great comparison.
The cultural friction was very real. The local Jammu communities often viewed the massive influx of refugees not with pity, but as a severe economic burden. They blamed the Pandits for driving up the prices of basic goods, crowding the schools, and increasing the cost of housing. The assimilation was incredibly strained and resentful.
Meanwhile, back in Kashmir, as the years rolled on, there was the massive looming issue of the physical assets they had left behind. Their ancestral homes, their commercial properties, their orchards.
Yeah.
To try and stop the absolute bleeding of the community's wealth, the Jammu and Kashmir government eventually passed the J&K Migrant Immovable Property Act of 1997. We really need to unpack the mechanics of this law because it's a fascinating legal attempt to freeze time.
Let's break it down. So the 1997 Act basically made the district magistrate of the area the legal overarching custodian of all migrant properties. And crucially, it restricted what the law called distress sales.
Right, a distress sale. It's an economic tragedy born of desperation. So imagine you own a beautiful 3-story home in Srinagar worth 50 lakh rupees, but you are currently starving in a tent in Jammu trying to pay for your child's medicine.
Okay.
Someone from the valley contacts you and offers you 2 lakh rupees in cash for the house. Because you're desperate, you take the pennies. The 1997 Act was designed to legally halt this massive exploitation. It required strict permissions for any sale, and importantly, it declared any illegal forced takeover of their property by locals or militants completely null and void. It gave the government the retroactive power to evict unauthorized squatters.
I understand the administrative logic, from a purely legal standpoint, it was a necessary intervention to stop systemic land grabbing. But looking at it practically from the perspective of a displaced family, it feels like putting a bureaucratic bandage on a ghost town.
How so?
You can pass all the laws you want, you can legally protect the bricks, the mortar, and the roof, you can keep the stamped paperwork in a filing cabinet in a government office, but if the family is too terrified of targeted violence to ever actually return and sleep in that house, who are you really protecting it for? It just becomes a legally protected, empty shell.
It highlights the massive, agonizing gap between legal ownership on paper and practical lived reality. You legally own a home, but you are effectively locked out of it by the very real threat of violence. And that physical separation from the physical soil of the valley leads us directly into the most insidious, invisible threat the community faces today.
Yeah.
It's not the violence of the 1990s. It's the quiet, steady, generational erosion of their cultural identity.
Because physical violence started the exodus, but time, geography, and exile are finishing the job. We are over 30 years out from the events of 1990 now. Let's look at the generational disconnect. Think about the children who were 4 or 5 years old when they were rushed out of Kashmir in the dead of night.
Right, they're grown now.
They are adults in their early 40s. They have built entire lives, careers, and families in Bangalore, New York, London, or Sydney. They know the trauma because they've heard the stories from their parents, but they have little to no visceral, emotional connection to the physical valley of Kashmir itself.
And with that massive geographic dispersal comes the inevitable loss of language and ritual. The mother tongue of the community is Kashmir, but it is fading incredibly rapidly.
Oh, I'm sure.
When you are scattered across India and the globe, surrounded by entirely different dominant cultures, families naturally default to speaking Hindi or English in the home to survive and compete. And when a language dies, it doesn't just take vocabulary with it. The unique idioms, the cultural nuances, the worldview embedded in that language die with it.
And you can't just practice an ancient culture in a vacuum. Look at the unique festivals of the Kashmiri Pandits, like Herath, which is their deeply specific multi-day version of Shivaratri. The sources point out that observing Herath traditionally relied heavily on the cohesive village structures of the valley. You needed your specific neighbors, the local artisans who made the specific clay pots, the specific winter geography of Kashmir. When you are living in a modern high-rise apartment building in Delhi or a suburb in New Jersey, those rituals completely lose their communal anchor. They become diluted.
And this cultural erosion is not just anecdotal. It is accompanied by a very real, mathematically terrifying demographic crisis.
The numbers.
The numbers are bad. The demographic research in our sources points out that the population growth rate of the Kashmiri Pandit community has plummeted to a mere 1.6%.
1.6%, that's so low.
That is well below the replacement rate because they are highly educated and career-focused, a trait they developed to survive. Many young people are marrying much later, having fewer children, and dealing with the psychological burden of inherited trauma. Sociologists and community elders looking at these hard numbers are expressing genuine, statistically backed fear of total demographic and cultural extinction by the year 2070.
So let me ask you this, because this is the ultimate paradox to me. This is a community that historically survived 8 brutal historical exoduses.
8 of them, yes.
8 times the tide washed their sandcastle away, and they survived by relying on their sheer intellect, their education, and their resilience. Why is this 9th exodus, the modern one, proving to be the fatal blow to their culture?
It is the ultimate tragic paradox of their historical survival strategy.
Explain that.
In the previous 8 historical exoduses, the persecution eventually subsided, regimes changed, and the community, or a resilient remnant of it, eventually returned to the physical land of Kashmir. The land anchored the culture.
Okay.
This time, however, the diaspora utilized their greatest historical asset, their intense focus on education, to achieve incredible economic success in global medicine, tech, and academia.
Yeah.
But to succeed globally, they had to assimilate locally. Survival in the 21st century global economy required blending into the cosmopolitan hubs of the world. Paradoxically, the very intellectual tools that ensure their physical and economic survival are the exact same tools rapidly accelerating their cultural assimilation and extinction.
Wow. They won the economic battle, but they are losing the cultural war.
Exactly.
Which brings us directly to the present day. Because despite this global assimilation, the political fight for justice and the deep, unresolved desire for return is still highly active. Let's look at the political landscape in 2026. Just recently, in May 2026, there were significant, highly visible protests in Jammu led by the youth All India Kashmiri Samaj, or YAAS, spearheaded by their president R.K. Bhatt.
Yes. The demands of the youth protesting in 2026 perfectly reflect the totally unresolved nature of this crisis. They are out on the streets 36 years later demanding a comprehensive, actionable rehabilitation policy.
What specifically do they want?
They're specifically asking for 15,000 additional secure jobs to be allocated under the Prime Minister's special employment package. They are demanding financial compensation for the youth who became overaged, the ones who basically lost their employable years languishing in refugee camps, waiting for government jobs that never materialized.
Right.
And they are demanding the right to hold internal community elections to ensure they have actual democratic representation rather than being spoken for by proxy.
But the realities of actually returning to the valley, even with a government job, are incredibly harsh. Over the past 3 decades, despite endless promises from successive governments, only about 6,000 Pandits have actually been rehabilitated in the valley.
It's a very small number.
And the way they are rehabilitated is intensely controversial. When the government tries to build separate, highly secure transit townships for them to live in, it is fiercely opposed by separatist groups and local militants who violently reject it as an Israeli-style settlement, changing the demographics.
And the security threat to those who do return is not abstract. It is ever present. We saw this vividly during the massive 2016 unrest in Kashmir, which was sparked following the death of the militant commander Burhan Wani.
Oh, yes.
The secure transit camps, which were housing the few thousand Hindu employees who had bravely returned under government schemes, were violently attacked by mobs throwing stones. Hundreds of those rehabilitated employees were forced to pack their bags and flee the valley in the middle of the night all over again. It was a terrifying, re-traumatizing echo of 1990.
I want to use an analogy here because it really clarifies the absurdity of the situation.
Yeah.
Imagine being handed the shiny new keys to your old house or a brand new apartment in your homeland.
Okay.
But to live there, you have to stay inside a guarded compound surrounded by barbed wire and paramilitary guards. And every time local politics flare up, a mob gathers at the gates to throw stones at your windows, screaming at you to leave. Is that truly going home? Or is it just moving into a gilded cage?
It's an illusion of return. And it highlights the deep systemic political dimensions of this crisis. Successive governments in New Delhi, regardless of which political party is in power, have historically treated the Kashmiri Pandits as a highly symbolic, emotional vote bank.
Always politics.
Always. Politicians invoke the tragic suffering of the Pandits on the national stage to score political points, to project a hardline stance on national security. But they consistently fail to provide the comprehensive, physically secure, and dignified reintegration the community actually needs.
Yeah.
This deep political disillusionment is why you see organizations like Pandit Kashmir demanding a completely separate, carved-out union territory within the valley exclusively for Hindus. Right. Furthermore, the community deeply resents the official government label classifying them as migrants.
Right, because migrant implies choice.
Yes. The word migrant implies a voluntary relocation for better economic opportunities. They rightly, fiercely demand to be legally recognized as internally displaced persons or IDPs who were forced out by targeted terror.
We've covered an immense, heavy amount of ground today. We started with the ancient roots of the Saraswat Brahmins and their 4,000-year history of philosophy and scholarship. We traced the dark, cyclical history of persecution across centuries, where they adapted by turning knowledge into their armor.
Yes, their portable wealth.
We unpacked the political boiling point of the 1980s, where rigged elections and foreign interference morphed political anger into an armed Islamist insurgency. We looked closely at the terrifying targeted killings of 1989 that shattered societal trust.
The sheer auditory horror of January 1990 that triggered mass flight.
Exactly. And the incredibly contested, fractured narratives of how and why it happened. And finally, we explored the agonizing reality of life in exile, the struggle over abandoned property, the slow, silent erasure of the kosher language, the terrifying demographic crisis, and the ongoing, highly politicized fight for a safe return that is still happening right now in 2026.
It is a profound historical tragedy. It is a story that forces us to critically examine the fragility of community bonds, the incredibly destructive power of politicized religion, and the long, agonizing, multi-generational shadow of displacement.
Which brings us right back to that freezing hallway and that single suitcase from the beginning of our conversation.
Right.
I want you to genuinely think about your own life. How much of your core identity, your specific accent, your favorite local foods, your family's unique traditions, your fundamental sense of safety is entirely tied to the physical soil and geography of your hometown.
That's a profound thought.
And how much of that identity could you honestly keep alive if you were violently forced to leave it behind forever, scattering your family to the winds in foreign cities?
It strikes at the absolute core of what it means to belong to a place.
It does. And so I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over as we end this deep dive. The physical landscape, the demographics, and the culture of the Kashmir Valley have been fundamentally, irreversibly altered by over 3 decades of militancy, heavy militarization, and time.
Yeah.
Even if, by some impossible political miracle, the Kashmiri Pandits were allowed to return tomorrow in absolute safety with full dignity and no barbed wire, does the Kashmir they are yearning for even exist anymore? Or are they simply homesick for a ghost? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.